Evelyn Gordon, and member of the Black Caucus and chairperson of the Oliver Cox Lecture Series Planning Committee. On behalf of the Black Caucus of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, I warmly welcome you to the second annual Oliver Cromwell Cox Lecture Series. This series was created to raise issues of race and equality in the scholarly format. Also, it was raised to augment the school's efforts to recruit black faculty and staff, and more importantly, to sensitize the entire academic community to black and minority concerns. We recognize the role of the School of Government in the shaping of thoughts and ideas which contribute to public policy. As students of government and politics, we feel an obligation to play a role in this process. As blacks, we welcome the opportunity to articulate these thoughts and ideas and to provide the community with our perspective and our views during the lectures. A large number of students, faculty, staff, and administrators worked very hard and long to put the lecture series together. The list of names are much too numerous to mention. However, some persons and staff we wish to especially thank. These are Dean Allison, Dean Carnesal, Dean Jackson, Mrs. Edith Stokey, a lecturer in economics, Mr. Walter Broadnax, a lecturer in public policy, Mr. Tom Sellers, Associate Director of Admissions, Professor Jonathan Moore, Mr. Nicholas Metropolis, and the Institute of Politics, and all their staff. We wish also to thank the Kennedy School Student Association and all others who gave so generously of their time and their effort. The theme of this year's lectures, Strategies for Black Americans in the 80s, was born of the need to address what we feel are critical socio-political and economic trends and developments, which have profound and far-reaching implications for the growth and development of blacks in this decade and beyond. These are thus of great import. The series this year consists of 3 panel discussions. The first panel, entitled Blacks and the Political Process, focused on an assessment of present black political power. Out of these discussions emerged the perception that, in order to become a more effective political force, we must become more bipartisan. We must become more politically active at both the national and local levels of government. As with other groups in this society, our needs and interests are permanent and must be addressed irrespective of political party in power. The second lectures address the question of access and ownerships for blacks in the media. The need for blacks to develop a level of consciousness and interest for the media was emphasized. The discussions also exposed the audience to present and future state of the communications industry as regards public policy, ownership, and programming. Tonight's discussion will be focused on national economic policies and their implications for the progress of black Americans in the 80s and beyond. 3 eminent black scholars will give their views and perspectives on the economic policies of the Reagan administration. The panel this evening is moderated by Mr. Christopher Edley, Assistant Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. In opening the last of our series, I bring you a quote from Dr. Cox, who we honor with the series. This quote, although written 4 decades ago, has relevance and application for today's black leadership. In discussing the role of black leadership, Dr. Cox stated, "The task of black leadership is very delicate. They must be specialists," he said, "in the art of antagonistic cooperation. Their success finally rests in their ability to maintain peace and friendship with whites, yet they must seem aggressive and uncompromising in their struggle for the rights of blacks. The struggle for blacks is intricately bound up with the political class struggle. Our success will be achieved with the ally of whites." I would now like to introduce the moderator, Mr. Christopher Edley. Mr. Edley is an assistant professor of law at the Harvard Law School. He's a graduate of the Kennedy School of Government Master in Public Policy program. Mr. Edley spent 3 years in the Carter administration as Assistant Director of the Domestic Policy Staff and Special Assistant to the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and Associate Chief of Staff in the White House. He held a faculty appointment at the Kennedy School and was a research fellow last year at the Institute of Politics. At Harvard Law School, his areas of teaching and research activities are administrative law, welfare law and policy, public interest litigation, and tax. I give you now Mr. Edley.
Good evening, everyone. Our three guests tonight are very distinguished indeed. In order of their presentations, they will be Ronald Ferguson, who is an assistant professor of economics at Brandeis University, who will speak to us on Reaganomics and its impact on blacks. James Hefner, who is an economist, a professor of economics and business at Morehouse College, who will speak to us on the economic status of blacks in the country today and the attitudinal changes in the black community, which are the preconditions for successful economic uplift of the black community. And Mario Baeza, who is an attorney with the New York law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. Each speaker will have 20 minutes and no more than 20 minutes to give their remarks. After which we will have an open question and answer period based on audience questions, and all the participants will be invited to respond to the questions. We expect to end this at I'd say no later than 10:15, just to give you a time frame to think about. With no further ado, oh, you didn't mention the reception. I'm sorry. There will be a reception afterwards, upstairs in the penthouse, in this building, to which everyone is invited. Don't be rowdy. With no further ado, Ronald Ferguson. Ronald received his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in August 1981. His areas of concentration include urban economics, housing economics, and applied microeconomics. Currently, he is an assistant professor at Brandeis University, where he teaches in both the Afro-American Studies and Economics departments. In 1977, he was a visiting instructor at Brown University, where he taught courses in the economics of income distribution and race relations in the U.S. and East African political economy. In 1980, Ferguson published an article with W. Wheaton entitled Determinants of Housing Inflation in the 1970s, Phase 1, Metropolitan Housing Price Indices with and without quality adjustments. He has participated in several panel discussions and seminars, which include a panel on individual and state responsibility for economic development at the Harvard Business School. Dr. Ferguson.
I want to begin by thanking everyone who was involved in setting this up and inviting me here tonight, particularly Laurie Jackson, with whom I had my closest contact. What I want to talk about tonight is the impact of Reaganomics on the poor, because blacks are disproportionately represented among the poor, and upon blacks. And the main point that I want to make is that the negative impacts of Reaganomics upon blacks and upon the poor are not necessary for the achievement of supply-side economic objectives, and cannot be understood in the context of the pursuit of these objectives. I think we have to go further than this and look instead at a fundamental shift in the morality of the executive branch of the United States government. For this presidential administration represents a sharp break with past administrations in two ways, and I want to separate those two ways out. One break is the tendency now to start talking about supply-side economics and to at least view supply-side economics to be the explicit objective or the explicit paradigm of federal economic activity. The second break is a strict break in morality and the ideology of the federal branch, and I want to distinguish these two. Now, in terms of supply-side economics refers to a very general change in thought among the economics profession that occurred during the 1970s. Okay, before the 1970s, we were very much caught up in Keynesian economic analysis. Keynesian economic analysis and policies concentrated on aggregate demand. We were below full employment. The policy was to do something to shift aggregate demand in order to bring the economy back to full employment and full capacity. During the 1970s, there were a number of supply-side shocks in the economy. In 1973, there was the oil price shock. There also was heavy grain price inflation that year. Construction factor prices, raw material prices inflated greatly during 1973. For the rest of the decade, there was high inflation in construction factor prices. There was another oil price shock in 1978. Each of these things had the impact of shifting backwards what we would think of as the aggregate supply curve in the economy. In other words, it made it such that firms wanted to supply less output at going market prices, and that led us into an inflationary environment with high excess capacity and high unemployment. Okay, the shift in the focus of both academia and to some extent public policy thinkers during the 1970s was, well, they said, well, the problem is supply-side shocks, so why don't we get a solution that matches the problem? Why don't we decide to try to design policies that will shift aggregate supply to bring us back into equilibrium? And this has the additional advantage that it will not produce extra inflation that trying to get back to full employment with demand-side policies would have. Okay, so this notion was just coming into maturity, really, at the time the Reagan administration came into power, and that's why we have a supply-side focus, and they talk about supply-side economics in the context of Reaganomics. Okay. Now, the other shift that occurred, other than the shift from primarily Keynesian to supply-side thinking, was a drastic shift in the morality in the executive branch. And by the shift in morality, I'm talking about a shift toward laissez-faire conservative ideology. If you want the best thing to read, just to get an overview of what this is all about, would be the introduction in the first two chapters of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, published in, I guess, about 1960. In those first two chapters, he outlines the basic laissez-faire conservative philosophy. Okay, the main shift here is a shift in the trade-off between freedom and the objectives of equality and efficiency. The main tension here is really, though, the tension between what Friedman would think of as freedom and the objective of equality. Okay, when a conservative defines freedom, what he's talking about is the absence of coercion in making trades. In other words, you only enter into those trades which are voluntary. And that indicates also that you do not, that society in general doesn't force people to pay taxes they would choose not to pay otherwise in order to force people who they otherwise would choose not to support. Okay, most conservatives have their own ideas about who society would choose to support if it really had free choice. Okay, and one of the points that I want to make as I go here is that the most important shift for us to focus on as blacks and as people concerned with the interests of the poor is not the shift towards supply-side economics. That's not the real enemy. That's not where it is. The most important shift is the shift toward a laissez-faire conservative ideology, the moral shift, because there are other ways to do supply-side economics and other ways to design these policies that do not have the negative impacts upon blacks and the poor that many of the Reagan's policies have. Now, in order to, I guess there's a very good example. I took out the paper 2 days ago. One of the Reagan administrators was talking. He said, well, this is a quote from the guy who wrote the article. He says, welfare programs themselves perpetuate inequity, according to administration officials, because they result in, quote, unequal treatment of people in similar circumstances. Welfare families, the officials say, are better off than similar families that forego welfare to take jobs. The implication being that welfare families, if they just get off their ass and go get a job, they could do as well as these other people who aren't on welfare and have similar incomes. Finally, some administration officials contend that it is fundamentally unfair for the government to redistribute income to the poor because, quote, income belongs to those who earn it. In the words of Robert B. Carlson, a White House policy analyst. Okay, that's very vividly illustrative of the underlying philosophy of the Reagan economic policy. Okay, just to show you how much, I should have taken my watch off when I started so I could pace. 10 minutes? Okay, I might be on schedule. Okay, just one more point before I move on to talk about how confused the public is and how mixed up the public is on this issue. There was a survey done recently by the Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Relations where they had two different questionnaires. They went around, they asked people if government spending has to be cut, what would you cut first, in what order? They had these things, and you had to list what the order. One way they wrote the survey, they had public welfare in the list. And with the survey written that way, a large majority of people put public welfare, or a large number, I don't know if it was the majority, but a large number of people put public welfare as the first thing that they would cut. When they changed the wording from public welfare to aid for the needy, people decided that they wanted to cut things like streets and highways and colleges and parks, all ahead of aid for the needy. Okay, what is public welfare if it's not aid for the needy? The public really has this notion promulgated by the Reagan administration that people on welfare are people who are lazy and undeserving. Okay, now I'm going to look for a minute now at some of the numbers in terms of the impact of the tax and budget cuts that went into effect already as of October 1981. And the point to be made from these numbers is that the grouping is that only people with incomes less than $10,000 per year suffered any net negative gain from the recent budget cuts. Okay, we have heard everybody talking about doing things on the backs of the poor and so on. If you look at the first table that I handed out here, you'll notice we have people getting net decreases in their incomes from cash benefit programs which have been cut, and net increases from changes in taxes. And just looking at, for example, 1982, that first column as we go across, we see that those with less than $10,000 income had a net decrease in pure cash benefits of $210 a year, and then it decreases as you go up toward $80,000 and over. The tax change was positive for everybody. And as we come down to the place where they give net benefits, net change, including in-kind benefits, which are things like food stamps rather than AFDC payments, we see that only the poor ended up behind. Okay, everybody else came out ahead. If there's any risk with respect to whether these jobs will be created that we're expecting, the poor are bearing a big burden of the risk because they start out behind, and they're only going to catch up if the economy comes back to full employment and starts to soak them up. Now, when you just look at the number, it says, well, that's $200 a year. That's not a lot. It's not anything to get really excited about. It's unfortunate that the poor had to lose, but they didn't lose that much. If you average that over 12 months a year, then that comes out only to about $16 a month, and that's not going to kill anybody. The problem is that that is an average number. There are groups within the population of the poor who suffered much more severely than that. I just want to read one paragraph from the publication I got this table from. This is called The Effects of Tax and Benefit Reductions Enacted in 1981 for Households in Different Income Categories. It was published by the staffs of the Human Resources and Community Development Division and the Tax Analysis Division of the Congressional Budget Office. It just came out last month. Certain types of households will be particularly affected by the benefit reductions. In the low-income category, for example, households that receive AFDC benefits and food stamps will lose about 5 to 10% of their total incomes on average if they have no earnings, and up to 20% of their incomes if they are employed. Such households are also likely to experience reductions in benefits from programs such as Medicaid, low-income energy assistance, and the housing subsidy programs if they participate in them. Okay, then it goes on. Okay, so the impact upon the poor is much more than this simple average figure of a loss of $200 a year. Now, why have this impact upon the poor? Why cut them? Well, the theory is that you cut them so that ultimately they have no choice but to go get a job. Okay, you make it so uncomfortable to live off the public that these folks get up and respond to this incentive, so to speak, and change their behavior. The problem in practice is a number of the benefit reductions are designed in a way that's such that they give a disincentive to go work. Okay, they're designed in a way such as you get to keep on net a smaller fraction of any additional dollar that you make. This is true of the food stamps cuts. It's also true of part of the AFDC cuts. Okay, economists know very well how to design benefit programs in a way that gives a marginal incentive to go get a job, to go get some extra work. I'm not sure why these programs were designed in this way. They don't build in the marginal incentive that we would think should be built into a supply-side focus. Okay, now, when we talk about giving incentives to go get a job, to go work, a surprising fact, and I have some other things I want to say, but I guess I'll throw this in there. I'll probably get stopped before I finish. But I was surprised recently to learn that there is really no cash benefit program for young able-bodied people who don't have children. Okay, I got on the phone, a friend of mine was telling me this, and so I called the welfare office, and I asked, and they said, well, there's general relief, but is the person you're calling for disabled? I said, no, he's not disabled, he just doesn't have a job. He said, well, does he have unemployment compensation? I said he had it, but it ran out. And they said, well, I don't think we can do anything for him. I said, you mean there's no cash transfer benefit program for young able-bodied people without kids? She said, no. I said, no wonder they go into crime. And she said, well, yeah, I agree. And so, anyway, so when we talk about cutting these programs to give these people an incentive to go get a job, they've already got the incentive. There's nowhere they can get any cash from. They qualify for food stamps. I recently looked at the results from a survey of young unemployed men from age 16 to 25, and it turns out most of them live off of friends and relatives. Okay, they do not live off of the public. That's AFDC is the main cash benefit program for the poor, and that mainly has to do with single-parent, female-headed households that have children. Okay. Okay, one other thing I want to throw in here that when I talk about, I think something that has happened that's characteristic all through this Reagan program is that it has shifted both the burden of present suffering onto the poor, and it has shifted the burden of risk when we think of future recovery onto the poor. The poor are the only group in society who will definitely lose if the economy does not recover as scheduled. And I think that shift, the willingness to make that shift, is characteristic and reflects this shift in ideology in the federal government I've been talking about. Now, to summarize what I've said so far about impacts on the poor, I guess the first point is that the incentive effect that some people claim should come from these cuts is simply not there, for the reasons I just talked about, because they haven't been designed in order to give extra incentives, and because the young unemployed able-bodied people are really not too much affected by these cuts. And the second point I want to make, which I haven't made yet, is that it would take very little to counterbalance these cuts that have been made for people who earn less than $10,000 a year. The second page that was passed around. See if I can find a copy of it. Okay, I just scribbled this out quickly. The top line on that second page gives a total tax cut for 1982 through 1985. You'll see the net tax cut goes from $38 billion in 82 all the way up to $144 billion in 1985. The second line gives the amount of money which would be required in order not to have to cut the net benefits for those with incomes below $10,000 a year. Okay, in other words, in order to leave them where they would have been without the benefit and tax changes. We see that those numbers range from 3.9, 4.5, 4.3, and $2.9 billion a year. The bottom line gives these numbers as a percentage of the total tax cut. You see that's 10%, 5%, 4%, and 2% of the total tax cut. It would take very little to take a little bit of the extra money that you gave these other folks, transfer it back down into AFDC and food stamps and energy assistance, and we wouldn't miss it. I mean, a few $1 billion sounds like a lot of money, but as a fraction of $100 billion, it's very little. As a fraction of total government budget, it's very little. As a fraction of GNP, it's even less. Okay, these cuts cannot be rationalized on the basis of an effort to achieve the objectives of supply-side economics, which are price stability, full employment, and faster economic growth. Okay, I think I just have a couple minutes left. 2? All right. And I'll summarize the rest of what I was going to say. I didn't know how long it was going to take me. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the impact of being in a recession on blacks in the labor market, and the impact upon blacks in the labor market if we don't come out of the recession quickly. If you think of how hiring is done, you can think of what we sometimes call the queuing theory of the labor market of hiring. You've got people lined up in order of their attractiveness to employers, and employers hire from the front of the line. Okay, there are several reasons why blacks are generally near the back of the line. One is just they don't have the seniority, less quality education, and so on. To the extent that we are in a recession and employees are not hiring all the way back to the back of the line, it is blacks who suffer the disproportionate impact of unemployment. Okay, if you look around at the steel, rubber, auto industries, there are disproportionate numbers of blacks being laid off in these industries. The Reagan administration is not helping at all because when when employers have an excess supply of labor facing them, they can afford to pick and choose from among the people who come to apply for jobs. And they suffer no pecuniary loss when they turn away qualified people because they've got more than enough qualified applicants. So it gives them a lot of leeway to turn away blacks if they prefer to hire whites. Okay, the Reagan administration signaled that it has sent to the business sector that they are not going to enforce affirmative action policies. They're cutting back their commitment to anti-discrimination policies, leaves firms free to pick and choose in this situation of excess supply. The only hope blacks really have is full employment, and we ought to root for Reaganomics to work to get back to full employment, because that's the only way that blacks are really going to get their jobs back. One last word is that the prospects do not look good for Reaganomics working right now. Reagan, it's almost unanimous throughout most economists agree, and most of Reagan's advisors agree, that in order for Reaganomics to work, budget has got to be cut, or otherwise the recession is going to be choked off in 1983 when they start to try to fund the budget, and the Federal Reserve decides it's not going to allow inflation, and it starts to reduce the money supply again. Okay, so the budget's got to be cut. Reagan has said he's not allowing taxes to be increased or the defense spending to be cut. The Democrats are saying they're not allowing anything else to be cut. So we're kind of stuck there, and we really can't get there from here where we want to go unless Reagan compromises. Most of his advisors seem to have realized this. Reagan seems they sat him down and they taught him that if this program is going to work, once you commit to tax cuts, you can't give in. You've got to stick there. Because if you don't stick there, then the business community will think you're shaky. They won't be sure you're going to keep the tax cuts, and they will not have an incentive to expand investment like we think they should. So Reagan says, all right, I'm going to stick to it so that they'll know exactly where we're going, and we'll get this investment. The problem is that the view of what's going on has changed a little bit. Even the advisors are saying now, well, we need a little slightly different mix of monetary and fiscal policy. We need to tighten up on the fiscal a little bit by decreasing the budget and let money be looser so interest rates can fall and let business go on out and start investing. And we need it soon, so we need Reagan to compromise soon so this thing can get underway. Reagan, meanwhile, sitting back with the lesson they taught him last year, saying, well, no, I can't give up on this. I've got to stick with these tax cuts. And so until somebody gives, we're not coming out of this recession. It may start, interest rates seem to be starting down, inflation's coming down, but that's really a mirage. If nobody gives, they'll be right back up there next year. So thank you.
Our next guest is Dr. James H. Hefner. Dr. Hefner is an economist, Charles E. Merrill Professor of Economics, and Chairman of the Department of Economics and Business Administration at Morehouse College. He received his Ph.D. at the University of Colorado in 1971. Dr. Hefner's interests and publications focus on manpower and industrial relations, with particular reference to employment practices and labor force participation of blacks. His thesis advisor was Ray Marshall, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor. Dr. Hefner has been very actively involved in many social and political organizations concerned with the economic development of blacks. He is an active member of Phi Beta Kappa and recently received the NAFIO Research Achievement Award. His long list of published and unpublished research includes the book Public Policy for the Black Community, Strategies and Perspectives. Dr. Hefner.
Thank you very much for those kind remarks. It's good to come back to Harvard. Several years ago, I was a research associate in the economics department. I was asked to briefly examine the economic circumstances of black Americans, to propose goals for the future, and to suggest ways of achieving these goals through implementable actions and policies. Now, this is a very difficult assignment, so let me proceed cautiously but timidly. You'll find that I do not proceed timidly. The first thing I'm going to say is that Thomas Sowell and I are at variance on a number of very important issues. However, I do believe that our differences cannot be accredited. I do not believe that our differences can be accredited to differences in blackness but rather to differences in ideology. I happen to favor, for example, more rather than less government intervention in the American economy. I favor public service employment for persons having difficulty finding jobs. I favor government assistance in a number of areas, including education, housing, and health care. I favor the minimum wage law, and of course someone will challenge me tonight about that, and government regulations on various aspects of the economy, including the environment and the way corporations conduct business. I favor strong affirmative action laws and less spending on war goods and more on domestic goods. In short, I see the federal government as remedying many of the social ills of our society. Sowell argues that the individual must take greater responsibility for the causes of their conditions, while I would argue that poverty and unemployment are significantly related to rising crime rates, hopelessness, frustration, alienation, and lawlessness. Sowell would argue that antisocial behavior is a function of individual failure and refusal to accept personal responsibility for one's actions. Sowell is consistent here in arguing for less government intervention in the affairs of people. However, the implication of this view is that there is a tenuous relationship between the role of government and the economic circumstances of black Americans. I say nonsense to this view. The truth of the matter is that black Americans have a history of inevitable reliance on government intervention in their behalf. Here I am referring to the abolition of slavery, Reconstruction, New Deal programs, Great Society programs, etc. While white Americans struggle to own private property, black Americans struggle in not being private property. So there were two forms of orientation here. Private sector capitalism meant more to one group than it did to the other, mainly because of the hierarchical nature of our society. The subordinate role of black Americans made it impossible for the market system to give them their civil rights. Black Americans are acutely aware of the role of the national government in dealing with state and local segregation laws. In other words, states' rights, another way of saying racial oppression and subjugation. Yet black Americans have always fought for their civil rights, even when not in migrating to urban centers to better their economic circumstances. The time they spent combating the system meant less time for developing economic centers of their own, even after employing the most vigorous Puritan work ethics. The point I am making here is that the market system rewarded others, many of whom may have been less fortunate than blacks, but all of whom had more civil rights and therefore a more solid base from which to launch their economic well-being. With these comments as background, let me now turn to my second point, that is the present economic circumstances of black Americans. As one would guess, the economic well-being of black Americans lags far behind the economic well-being of white Americans. The black unemployment rate is roughly 18%, twice the rate among whites. Black teenage unemployment is 40%, a national tragedy, and is projected to reach a level of 45% at the end of the year. The median income among black families is around 57%, a ratio that has not changed in a decade. And welfare dependency is increasing among a disproportionate number of black families with a single parent and heads of households whose employment prospects are diminishing at an alarming rate. In the midst of the economic problems of the black community, the nation is in a recession with roughly 10 million unemployed and 1.2 million people discouraged from looking for work. No matter how one puts it, the American economy has problems, and black Americans must brace themselves for even more difficult times ahead. It is under the Reagan administration that supply-side economics was launched to deal with an economy with many of the problems left by the Carter administration. Ron has given you a very good analysis of supply-side economics, so I'm going to skip some pages here. But what I'd like to do is talk a bit more about the specific nature of supply-side economics in actual terms. First, there's the tax cut. I have here around $750 billion, Ron, which seems to be a little different from your figures, for individuals and for businesses, which theoretically, what? Okay, very good. All right, so $750 billion for individuals and for businesses, which theoretically is supposed to stimulate greater savings and investments. Second, there are projected reductions of $550 billion in federal spending. This is supposed to achieve a balanced budget. Third, pardon me?
These figures are over how many years?
This is 82 information. In other words, I'm giving you projection reduction of $550 in federal spending. I'm just looking at
next 3
that's
fiscal
right.
years.
That's right. And this is supposed to achieve a balanced budget. I can give you the actual figures here. I have them. But what I'm looking at is just what Reagan gave us recently. These are his projections. Third, control of the money supply. And fourth, deregulation of the policies of business firms. Here there is an explicit design to reduce the influence of government in business affairs. Here also the national government is saying to business firms to develop their own affirmative action programs, to develop their own affirmative action goals and timetables. Needless to say, Reagan had his doubters among economists when he proposed supply-side economics as the solution to the ills of the American economy. It had not been really empirically tested, and almost all of these economist doubters could not see how interest rates would remain relatively low through tight control of the money supply. For if interest rates started gyrating, they argued, this would in turn strangle investment and reduce the rate of growth of GNP. In actuality, interest rates have gyrated, and the federal deficit has jumped from the $42 billion announced by the administration in February 1982 to over $100 billion projected near the end of the year. I would not be surprised if the deficit reached a level of $120 billion by the end of 1982. I looked at some figures here, and of course this is only a projection, and 120 many economists feel is not a bad figure. But the essential question is, when will the economy, as I see it, take its foot off the black community's neck? And I try to put that as descriptively as I can. The answer is when it deals with its own problems. But here again, the black community is back to John Maynard Keynes' in the long run, we are all dead. Still, there is an overwhelming argument for economic growth. Some scholars say that the black community is like a caboose. When the train starts moving, so will the caboose. Others say that economic growth is like a tide. When it comes, it lifts all boats to the same level. Since all black folks are in the same boat, I argue, then it is reasonable to say that the black boat will rise with the white boat. Well, what if the black boat is shipwrecked and at the bottom of the ocean? No tide, however large, will be able to lift that boat. Alternatively, what if the black boat is riddled and dilapidated? What responsible captain would advocate a rising tide? Resolving the black problem in America is far more complex than just stimulating the economy. Through the years, the economic growth has had little impact on resolving many of the problems of a very significant segment of the black community. Here I'm referring to black teenagers. Yet still, economic growth is paramount to black economic recovery. Yet one has to question the rationale of the proposed reductions in government spending for social programs in terms of the administration's sincerity in creating a rising tide that will benefit everyone. In sum, what I am saying is that the current administration does not appear to be about the business of bringing the black boat from the depth of the ocean, or if it is boat wrecked, of repairing it. So the question now becomes, what do black Americans go from here? That is, where do black Americans go from here? First, I think that black Americans must recognize that they are in the same boat and that there is potential value to cooperation. The point of being in the same boat becomes clear once black Americans recognize that they are a stigmatized collectivity in a society emphasizing individualism. Since there exists in the American society a hierarchical structure which contradicts the society's philosophy of egalitarianism, blacks are set apart structurally from white ethnic groups. For example, racial public policy has always reflected the dilemma of a society attempting to act within an individualistic, egalitarian structure, while blacks themselves were viewed as a collectivity. Once, only under pressure, is there a relaxation of the structural position of blacks in America. This pressure creates a favored group in the black community whose very existence is designed to obfuscate the hierarchical nature of the society. This favored group has to pay a high price. Since there are insufficient opportunities available to blacks in general, I argue, those blacks who purchase the scarce opportunities often pay in terms of their blackness and complete acceptance of the American dream, whose fulfillment is based on individuals taking advantage of opportunities. My argument here is that individualism becomes the controlling factor in the hearts of the favored blacks, while whether conscious or subconscious. Additionally, I am arguing that many of these blacks are not aware of the supply problem of opportunities available to other blacks. As they often say, if I made it, so can they. The point I wish to make is that there is a supply problem of opportunities in the black community. If there are 100 blacks, there will be far less than 100 opportunities available to them. I am arguing that race constrains opportunities for blacks and not attitude, although I recognize that some blacks are denied the limited opportunities available to them because of attitude. The problem becomes one of increasing the supply of opportunities for blacks. Well, that will not come about through the efforts of the present administration. So that leaves a problem scarcely or squarely in the lap of the black community. However, this strategy is only viable when blacks see themselves in the same boat, traveling the sea of racism in search of the shores of freedom and equality. Now, assuming that the primary goals in the black community becomes one, collective uplift, and two, strength through diversity, achieving these goals are not difficult. Both goals require two strategies: black people working together and black people working as individuals. The first strategy of black people working together simply means that they develop cooperatives and CDCs. These are blacks who have a limited supply of human capital and must pool their resources for the purpose of advancement. On the other hand, blacks with an abundance of human capital go their individual ways, developing black businesses primarily in professional services, in pushing cooperative arrangements and entrepreneurship in which blacks operate in a plethora of markets. The probability of failure in achieving the first goal of collective uplift diminishes appreciably. The heart of what I am trying to say is that there must be a metamorphosis of the black mind in order for black Americans to take advantage of their aggregate personal income of roughly $125 billion. This metamorphosis of the mind will ensure that blacks invest more of their aggregate personal income in human capital, education, in physical capital, businesses and land, and liquid capital, stocks and bonds, for long-run survival. All in all, blacks must not wait for white prosperity to trickle down to the black community. urban enterprise zones are suspect because it is unclear about their employment effects. It is clear, however, that the central city must offer more incentives than tax credits, as the environment itself is important. With the outmigration of manufacturing firms, it is obvious that those which decide to come back into the city must be of a labor-intensive nature. Capital-intensive firms would broaden the tax base but have minimal impact on employment. It would appear that net benefits can only be derived from the urban enterprise zone program when the economy is expanding. In the absence of such, there are only net losses. Such can be said about the new federalism, because as unsatisfactory, ineffective, and hypocritical as federal domestic programs have been, they have been better than state and local apathetic neglect. What little political redress blacks have experienced has been federally initiated. Until recently, it has been much easier for the most reactionary forces to gain and maintain control of local communities and influence state legislatures than it has been at the national level. On the other hand, more local autonomy, buttressed by federal funds, could be important for black-dominated or controlled cities. Every scenario I have entered into this discussion underscores the importance of black unity, and in regards to the new federalism, a national black multifunctional organizational infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hefner. Our third and final guest is Mario Baeza, who is presently a partner at the New York law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton, where he specializes in corporate finance and represents a number of minority-owned businesses, several minority enterprise small business investment companies, as well as large and small corporate clients. Mr. Baeza is the first black man to have started as an associate in a major New York law firm and become a partner. He has served as an economic consultant at the Rand Corporation. He published Efficiency, Equality, and Justice in Admissions Procedures to Higher Education, a constitutional model for resolving conflicting goals and competing claims, and has lectured on topics such as law in economics and law as an instrument for social change. He is a member of the American Bar Association, the Subcommittee on Small Business Investment Companies, and the Bar Association of the City of New York. Mr. Baeza received a BA from Cornell University, where he graduated with honors and distinction in government, psychology, and economics, and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. He received his law degree from the Harvard Law School. My friend, Mario Baeza.
Good evening. In the next 20 minutes, I would like to explore with you a few themes about Reaganomics and its impact on the economic mobility of black people. Because time is short, I will necessarily have to speak with broad strokes, or to speak with a broad brush, with respect to the major socioeconomic transformation which is right now happening in our society. Tonight I would like to focus my comments on that aspect of Reaganomics termed the new federalism, and in particular to discuss with you the imperatives of this new federalism in terms of the goals, our goals for the future, and the attendant strategies for implementing those goals. But before I get into new federalism, I just can't resist making some passing shots at the efficacy of Reaganomics, or as Vice President Bush once called it, voodoo economics. As has been mentioned, vis-a-vis black people, the premise of Reaganomics is that increased economic growth, spawned by new economic policies, will prove a more powerful engine of minority progress than all of the federal grants, affirmative action, and other governmental policies that have heretofore been tried. In short, the best thing that could happen to the urban poor is that a revitalized economy could provide them with a meaningful opportunity to participate as a contributor in the great economic enterprise. Well, it certainly sounds catchy. It's sort of like apple pie and motherhood. Who can argue with it?
But if you take a closer look at the program itself, at the awesome budget cuts aimed disproportionately at the poor, and particularly poor blacks, or at the tenuousness of the economic logic underpinning the program, then you realize that for better or for worse, this is all just a grand experiment, with the risk of failure falling initially and perhaps permanently on the poorest among us. I say Reaganomics is a grand experiment because that's exactly what it is. There are good reasons to be skeptical about it, to be skeptical about so-called supply-side economics. For openers, the fact is that no matter what you've read or heard, economists simply do not know for sure the extent to which movements in the economy are caused by fiscal policy, monetary policy, by external shocks, or by destabilizing forces internal to the private economy itself. Moreover, as noted economist Walter Heller wrote recently in an article for the Wall Street Journal, a program, and I quote, "A program premised on promises that real GNP will surge ahead at a 4.5% rate in 1982 through 5, and that investment will jump from 10.5% to 14.5% of GNP, while inflation drops from 11% to 5% a year and short-term interest rates from 14% to 6%, ought to be viewed as a candidate for that's incredible." As Dr. Ferguson stated, upon further examination, Reagan's program fails again and again to meet its own supply-side tests of spurring incentives to save, work, and invest, and channeling resources into efficient and growth-promoting uses. I could go on and on. I guess where I come out is that I look at the very real sacrifices being demanded of those least in a position to sacrifice. And I find myself in agreement with Representative William Clay of Missouri that the, quote, "course in which we are embarked is economically, politically, and morally wrong." So much for supply-side economics. I would really like to spend the rest of my time this evening dealing with the political implications of Reaganomics, the proposed dismantling of the federal bureaucracy and the return of power to the states. As Mr. Reagan put it in a speech last year to the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I quote, "With our economic proposals, we are staging a quiet federalist revolution, leading to the day when the states will not only have responsibility for programs that properly belong at the state level, but the states will have the tax resources now usurped by Washington returned to them. My administration is committed heart and soul to the principles of American federalism, which are outlined in the original Federalist Papers of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay." End of quote. I use this quote to illustrate a few things. First, that the so-called new federalism is anything but new. Second, that what Reagan is talking about is profoundly a philosophical and ideological vision which largely centers around returning the federal government to pre-New Deal size by returning federal responsibilities to the state and local levels. The quote also gives us some perspective on new federalism. Although the dismantling of federal power will necessarily mean a dilution, if not abrogation, of the federal government's role as benefactor and protector of black people, it is, in my opinion, not being done for that purpose. We may not agree with all the aspects of Mr. Reagan's new federalism, but we do have to acknowledge that at least at some level, on some levels, it is legitimate. The fact of the matter is that the federal bureaucracy has gotten out of control. Jimmy Carter was elected on a platform of cutting the federal bureaucracy and red tape. He tried and was overwhelmed. The fact of the matter is that the nexus between those governed and their government has grown intolerably distant, and abuses by federal government agencies, particularly in doling out funds to states, has run rampant. I am reminded of a case I once studied in constitutional law called Brown v. Maryland, and I think that's the name of the case, in which Justice John Marshall held that the power to tax a state-run activity is the power to destroy. Well, the virtually unreviewable power of some green-eye-shaded bureaucrat to hold up a grant and aid for a state or local unit for any of a million reasons is also the power to destroy. So I think to some extent this new federalism is healthy. However, in the context of civil rights enforcement and protection, it is also frightening. I guess I am unwilling to indulge the presumption that Sam Pierce, Reagan's only black cabinet member, has made, namely that state governments have outgrown the inclination to discriminate, quote, because there's much more public consciousness about fairness, close quote. So much for Sam Pierce. I guess I can't forget so easily that the federal apparatus which is being dismantled, to the extent it related to the protection of black people's civil rights, grew out of abuses of state rights and responsibilities, not out of meddlesome federal initiatives. Nevertheless, one gets the sense these days that new federalism is a concept that has come of age. And whether or not we can effect enough political pressure to save a program here or there, the point is that the commitment of the federal government, all three branches, is gone, at least for the time being. We must therefore deal with this new federalism aggressively and quickly, for I believe that dealing with it effectively will be the key to improving black economic mobility in the 80s. I would now like to turn to one of the means by which Reagan plans to return power to the states. I refer to the consolidation of categorical grants into block grants. Categorical grants are essentially financial assistance given out by the federal government to states, political subdivisions, and institutions. They are grants targeted for specific uses and purposes, and they come with all kinds of regulatory strings attached. The red tape involved in these grants and the compliance with federal guidelines and rules, which are more often than not contradictory and ambiguous, has created enormous confusion and problems. In any event, Reagan has planned to lump a whole variety of these categorical grants together and to give the states one lump sum or a block grant which, within limits, the states can allocate or distribute as they see fit. For minorities, the problem with the shift from categorical grants to block grants is that there will no longer be any federal monitoring of the way in which vast amounts of money are spent. This is vital to minorities since a major part of the monitoring function involved the enforcement of non-discrimination provisions in the use of the funds by grantees. In 1978, for example, HEW had allocated 1,102 professional employees to the single task of enforcing the non-discrimination duties of HEW grantees. To give you sort of an example of how this really works, under basically a historical categorical grant program, cities get money, for example, from HUD to build low middle-income housing. But before they can actually get the money, the federal government used to ask the question, well, where's the housing going to be built? And demonstrate to us what impact building the housing in this location is going to have in solidifying an already existent segregated housing pattern. And I think if you go back and sort of review what's happened administratively between HUD and very many cities, you will find that cities have more often than not attempted to build low and middle income housing in black and poor areas, and in ways where you would keep basically minorities on the right side of the track. They were always embroiled with the federal government over these kinds of issues. Well, that issue is sort of a dead issue now, or with the move to block grants, because the federal government simply isn't going to be asking those questions. And how and where they build housing, the nature and character of the police force that they now hire, in terms of whether they've got an appropriate number of minorities and new hirings that they do with some federal funds, all these kind of monitoring functions, which the federal government has historically been doing, are no longer going to be done, and it's all going to be handled at the local level without review. Perhaps even more significant to black people than the loss of this monitoring function by the federal government is the fact that all of our organizations are geared towards monitoring what happens in Washington. We have our lobbying groups in Washington. We have in place various professional and other organizations that monitor what the federal government does vis-a-vis black people. But who do we have in Mobile, Alabama, or in Valdosta, Georgia? Who do we have lined up to deal with Boss Hogg and them Duke boys? Or with Mayor Koch, for that matter? We are, I believe, totally unprepared to deal with the inevitable decentralization of power and decision-making about to be thrust upon America. For example, there is not one black lobbying group dealing with the State Assembly of New York. And so I believe that we must look more closely at how and where we can get access to power, if not power itself, at the state and local levels. This will be the next battleground, the supreme challenge for black people in the 80s. We will need our leaders at the County Board of Estimates when they're doling the funds out, at city councils, on school boards around the country, in mayor's offices and in governor's offices. I think the focus in Washington in the next several years will be a misplaced focus to some extent. I still think you need to have it there, but we really need to be thinking right at the local level with who's doling out the money and where that money is going. Strangely enough, all this brings us back to basics like the vote and the power of the vote. If we are to succeed, we do have several black organizations which are organized on a decentralized basis and which could serve at least as the starting point for our efforts. I speak of the National Urban League, I speak of the NAACP. Although these organizations have somewhat fallen out of favor lately, or so it seems, they are at least still here, and they must be used. They have the necessary physical capital, like desks and chairs and telephones and offices and people. And they also have a history that we as black people can be proud of, and a proven history of success in the area of voter registration. I guess the bottom line to what I'm saying this evening is that in the face of this new federalism, we cannot afford the luxury of starting over from scratch, of ignoring the strides made by Du Bois and other predecessors in the struggle. These organizations are our inheritance, our legacy. We must breathe new life into them. We must marshal all power at our disposal and bring it to bear in dealing with this newest challenge to black economic mobility in the years to come. Thank you.
We'd like to open up the floor to questions, very brief comments, and you can direct them either at the panel in general or at specific individuals. I want to emphasize that we'd like people not to make speeches. We'd like people just to ask pointed questions, and I guess I won't hesitate to jump in and try to steer you back on course if you start to wander around. Okay. Anyone? Who's first? Yes, in back. Please stand up and shout.
There's a mic over here.
What's the name of the plan?
On what station?
Yeah,
Is anybody familiar with that?
No, I never heard of it.
Never heard of it.
Johnny, have you heard of it? Is anybody familiar with that? So it's not a specific piece of legislation at this stage. Next. Well, thank you, everyone. Oh, yes. question
Okay,
was to comment on the workfare regulations that have been proposed in this state by Governor King. Implement.
Okay, I have been following that really closely. I understand that the problem was that Governor King wanted to try to force welfare mothers to take jobs or lose their AFTC. And that my understanding is that that has been changed, that now there's no longer a provision in there to force them to take jobs anymore. I'm not sure exactly what the change was. In the newspaper article I read on it was saying that they were trying to hold it up for another month in order to make it clear what the change was, that people didn't really understand what it had been changed to. I guess what were you going to say? Okay, I think it's obviously a good idea to make the opportunity available for people to get training and to help to place them in jobs. I would have a problem with forcing people to do things, and I'd have to have to give my own personal opinion on it, I'd have to have a better feel for exactly what it is they want to force people to do. Okay, so I don't want to say anything more because I don't know much more on it.
Anybody else?
Okay, enterprise zone should be an issue somebody should be interested in.
We've got a question in back here, yes. I don't think so. The accent's wrong. So what?
We all look alike.
Questions?
I don't believe that. I don't believe it. At Harvard, you get that.
This question is for Dr. Ferguson or anyone else who can handle it. You talk specifically about the change in the Reagan administration that's having the greatest impact is a change in morality more than the change in economic policy.
Right.
And I suspect that given the indicators that you've outlined, that this is a correct assessment of change. My concern is, based on what the other two panelists have proposed in terms of what has to be done by blacks to become more involved in the political process and to lessen the impact of these policies on us, I don't really see in your outline any way that we can make any kind of activity or take any kind of action that would have some impact on the shift in morality. I think one of the problems that we face historically is the absence of a moral factor when policies are being decided that are going to impact on blacks. And I wonder just how you see us making some kind of impact on the shift in morality.
Good point. And the last thing on my note says fire Reagan. Okay. I don't think we can make an impact on changing morality, or at least we shouldn't spend scarce resources in the short run on trying to change people's morals. I think that the solution, particularly with respect to Reaganomics and the ideology embodied therein, the solution is to get Reagan out of office. And I think that most of us should work toward that end in 1984. Okay, additionally, I do have, I only had 20 minutes. There are a lot of things I could have said on other topics. I do have ideas about what we need to be about. I agree with pretty much what the other two panelists said. I think that the shift in the focus of black political economic activity in the 1980s does need to be away from the federal level some. We do need to revive the local urban leagues and NAACPs. I think we also need to start working even outside of these established organizations in small groups to do whatever it is we think needs to be done, rather than relying on established organizations where there's a meeting every week whether or not there is something to be done. Have a task to do, bring a group of people together to do it, and then disband. And I've run into a number of young professionals, so to speak, who come out of school in the last 5 or 6 years lately, who indicate that they are willing to do this kind of thing. Okay, we're just getting to a place right now where we have some threshold numbers. We have people with certain expertise who are not willing to give up their careers and shouldn't be. I think we should stay in our careers and try to be at the top because that does give us a power base. But I think there are a number of people who are willing to use their expertise in pretty much the same way that most other people do philanthropic activities and come together to get a job done quickly. Okay, I'll stop there with that. But I think your point is well taken, that my strategy out of most of what I said tonight would be we've got to change the federal administration. There's, not moralizing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, were you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'd just like for the panel to respond to the idea of cutting the minimum wage law for teenagers to improve unemployment, and preferably Dr. Hefner.
Well, of course, I indicated that I'm for the minimum wage law. Economists argue that it creates unemployment, and that is because, presumably, this is the case, you're above the equilibrium wage level. My argument is this, that what if blacks are underemployed? Then indeed, increasing the minimum wage may not create the unemployment effect that we all think. Black teenagers are underemployed to a considerable extent, meaning, of course, that the value of their marginal product is much greater than the price that they are receiving. And and that is something that I believe, that I've looked at this. I did a book several years ago in which I looked at this question of underemployment with respect to black teenagers, and I found a great deal of underemployment. But the argument is that that when you increase the minimum wage, that the value of the marginal product of the teenager will become greater, will become less. Will it be greater? The value of the marginal product will be less than the price, and in terms of the minimum wage. And I don't argue that. I just argue that it's a good thing for us to have, and underemployment is the way in which I argue.
I want to say a little bit about that, too. I think there's some trade-offs involved with respect to the minimum wage. I think the consensus on the economic studies that have been done recently is that whether or not the value of the marginal product equals the minimum wage or is greater than or less than, that the minimum wage does have a disemployment effect. Not everybody agrees, but the consensus among economists is that more young people would be hired if the minimum wage was lower. The trade-off, however, is that there are a lot of single-parent households supporting their families on the minimum wage. And if you calculate the yearly income on the minimum wage, it only comes to $6,700 a year. So if you start cutting the minimum wage, you're cutting the bottom out of a number of families' household incomes. The argument on the other side of that some people bring up for teenage unemployment, they say, well, we need, whether or not these people are getting paid what they're worth, we just need to get them into jobs so that they can develop the habit of having a job, get maybe a little bit of training in the job, and maybe start to move upward from there. So that's sort of, if you buy that argument, it's a long-run argument that trades off against this short-run argument that has to do with the level of people's standard of living today. Okay, now one other thing in there with the standard of living thing. A traditional, just efficient markets model would say the solution should be to allow the wage to settle to a market equilibrium wage, which would probably be below the minimum wage, and then have tax and transfer policies to bring people up to the desired standard of income. And I think if we just focus not on the long-term training part of it, but instead just upon the short-term question of how do we maximize the share of GNP going to the poor, I suspect you've got the two alternative scenarios. One, you've got some people out there working, earning the minimum wage. You've got other people who are unemployed because of the minimum wage, who go to the government and say, why don't you give me some help? I don't have any help. I need to be helped. I need to make it. So the government looks and says, well, other folks like you are earning this out in the labor market, so I'll give you this much to kind of make you feel pretty well off relative to these other people. Now imagine if the minimum wage is cut and all of a sudden employment expands and you got everybody who's poor employed at a wage of $1.75 an hour. Okay, now the poor go back to the federal government. They say, we don't have enough. We can't buy food. We can't eat. federal government looks at them and says, well, look, all those other people in the same position you're in. Okay, you're not anything unusual. They're making it, you can make it. And I think that the poor in aggregate are probably better off with the minimum wage and other tax and transfer policies to feed the people who don't have jobs than they'd be if everybody had jobs but had to have transfer payments on top of that, because I suspect that the level of transfer payments would drop. Okay, I am, however, on the other side, still concerned with the long-run employment effect. And one last thing I want to throw in here is that there already exists a provision in the law where employers who would like to hire young people can get an exemption from the minimum wage. That doesn't really require new legislation. I don't know exactly where it is, but I've been told that that can already be done. So that really doesn't require new legislation if employers really want to do it. I think I'll stop. I just thought of something else, but I'll stop.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I'll address this to the entire panel. As I understand it, I think that one of Reagan's basic premises for his campaign was to fight against the problem of inflation. And I think that there was a general perception among Americans that inflation was the #1 problem facing the American economy at the time of his campaign and his election. I'd just like to ask, do you think that this is a correct priority, especially for blacks in America? Because a lot of what he states is that government spending should be cut to reduce money supply and therefore reduce inflation. Is that a correct priority? And how important is that? And if it isn't important, what is more important? Is that the only formula that we have available to reduce inflation, or is inflation really the most important priority for government right now?
Well, I argue that unemployment is obviously a greater problem, and it's because of look at the economic circumstances of black Americans. Volk, on the other hand, sees inflation, and that's why we have a tight money supply program. If you look at what happens to people who are unemployed, I prefer people fighting inflation employed than being unemployed. Now, that's a very simple way of putting it, but I'm not sure that you can really come up with a right answer there. As a black person, I look at unemployment as being more important.
I'll come on the other side. Okay, I think that there are other strategies to fight inflation, but on the question of whether inflation should be the priority, I think it should be in the short run, because what happens with inflation is not only the rate of increase of the price level goes up, but you get the rate of increase of the prices in different areas going up at different amounts. A lot of uncertainty comes into the economy, and the more uncertainty there is with respect to future price levels, the more antsy investors are about investing. So if investors hold back on investing or wait back for things to settle down before they decide what they're going to do with their money, you get a decrease in aggregate economic activity during that period, and that will produce the unemployment itself. So I think we have to actually set inflation as the priority in the short run, because if we don't, the effects of inflation will decrease the unemployment. However, there are other ways to deal with inflation. I mean, there are many economists who believe in wage and price guidelines. They had a successful wage and price experiment during during World War II. There was many people think that the experienced wage and price guidelines in the early 1970s was successful, that the inflation afterwards was because of the oil price shock and because the Fed overreacted on the money supply. Okay, so I mean that's an alternative which, for example, Sir Arthur Lewis, who's a Nobel Prize-winning black economist at Princeton, has suggested that we should use wage and price guidelines instead of recession. There's a heated debate. Economists aren't unanimous on this, but I do think that inflation has to be a priority, because if it's not, it leads to unemployment.
Let me ask you something, Ron. Now, right now, do you still believe that inflation should be a short-run primary goal?
Well, not now, because the inflation rate has come down.
All right.
But,
okay.
I mean,
Yeah,
for
but
the last
it's come down partly at the expense of unemployment
Right,
going
I mean,
hell
I
up.
think
right,
the
that's right.
The
And that's
unemployment
when I
that's
have
gone
problems
up
with
is
that.
black
That's right.
unemployment largely.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the price you have to pay to get your inflation down. And I
I'm
don't
not
know
willing
that
to,
in the long run it
I'm
makes
willing to pay that price. It's an enormous
don't agree
price
with
for blacks.
I think.
To get the last word, I think that if we could have found another way, and we probably could have, but if we could have found another way to bring inflation down without the unemployment effect we should have, that would have been the desirable way to do it. But since we didn't, I think that if we had not dealt with inflation, we would have gotten here anyway. Maybe not because the Fed increased the money supply, but because there was a decrease in aggregate investment and aggregate demand dropped, so there wasn't demand for all the labor out there.
Ron, since we have this drop back in inflation, why don't we see the signs of an upturn?
So I mean, I think it's
Okay, the signs, you don't have signs of an upturn right now, I think, because there's still a lot of investor uncertainty for one thing, and the other thing is the real interest rate is still very high. The difference between expected levels of inflation and actual nominal interest rates are greater than expected return on investment. So interest rates have got to fall further before investors will think that they can start borrowing money at current interest rates and make a profit.
And why aren't the interest rates falling? Since inflation is falling, why is there a lag given the sophistication of the audience that sets the interest rate policy?
The interest rate has two components to it. One of which is the expected future rate of inflation. Okay, and even though actual inflation rates have fallen, it's probably true that the expected future rate of inflation has not fallen yet, because people suspect that ultimately when Reagan tries to fund the deficit, the Fed is going to jump in and tighten the money supply, and interest rates will go up and choke off the recovery. But on the other side, the reason the inflation would come about is if the Fed does not jump in and try to choke off the economy, and it instead monetizes the debt, and you get that inflation. So there's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people think there may be high inflation returning within the next year, and so interest rates have not fallen for that reason. I mean, there's
how
Moderator, can we get another couple questions in before
who's next?
That lady is next, but we should our conversation is heavy.
You don't want to solve this inflation problem?
Not really, not tonight.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
I'd like to address this question to the panel. Do you think that the Urban Enterprise Zone program would be successful in getting businesses to move into blighted urban areas? And if you do, what other likely outcomes do you think the program will have?
I guess we should get short answers this time.
Well, I tried to address that question by saying that what you really want labor-intensive manufacturing firms to locate in the central city, and the employment effect will be pretty good here. But I suspect that you're going to get manufacturing capital-intensive firms locating, which will broaden your tax base, but will create minimum employment effects. I also believe this, that you can get some net losses, because when you have a firm moving from one location to the other, a firm has moved out of one location, creating a loss in terms of jobs going into another. And I'm not sure that's a very good thing if the firm itself expands in another area while staying where it is. And I think that the net benefits can be generated when the economy is expanding, not when the economy is at a recessionary stage. So in sum, what I'm saying is that it's according to the nature of the industries moving into these cities as to whether or not you get the right employment effects. Tax incentives just not enough. These people are looking at crime, they're looking at the quality of life in these cities, and you got to deal with those factors as well in terms of this urban enterprise zone program working.
One last thing I just want to add. I think the Reagan people who are designing their urban enterprise zones recognize that you need a lot of other things, and what they're doing is trying to get the local areas to compete to provide those other things. They want the local areas to come and tell them why an enterprise zone should come here. Now, I think you may have a substantial waste of resources as local areas try to compete to get those resources in there. When they start improving the streets and say they're going to do various other things to improve local public resources, I'm not sure the net benefit for the program will balance that, particularly when you've got cities that are already in fiscal distress. The other problem is that if the program does work, then it's going to enhance the environment in these enterprise zones. It's going to thereby cause the value of property surrounding the enterprise zones to be bid upward as people start to want to be close to these jobs and good transport networks and so on. As that value gets bid upward, people who now rent houses to the poor are going to start reselling them to people who want to renovate them and sell them and rent them or sell them to young professionals and so on. So I think you're going to get a displacement problem if the program does work. Okay, I'm not sure how to deal with that, but these are issues I think are in there somewhere.
Okay, and the likeliness of it happening, you didn't comment on. And the
likeliness of it actually
the
working.
benefits being sufficient enough to get businesses to move.
I think they can get businesses in there because with the stuff they're offering. They're talking about $1,500 a head tax credit to firms for each person they employ. They're talking about an extra $50. How'd they go? I don't know. There's a whole long list of incentives. They're really paying firms dearly to get in there. I think that same money might be very much better used in just matching unemployed people with jobs, or if there's some other such program.
Yes. My question, my voice is very heavy, so I won't. My question is directed to the whole panel, and I have to admit I've enjoyed your talks and your various disagreements and agreements, but see, they're kind of beyond me. I want to know, what do I tell my children for the 1980s? I have a child 16, one 14, and one 5. So me talking wage equilibrium, all this jazz will not mean anything to them. They want jobs. They want a chance at the American pie. We've all bought into it. That's why we're here. I'm a mid-career student here. I'm a little older than some of the people here. So that kind of thing that we talked about is hip, you know, it's good for intellectual theory, but I'm a very applied kind of person. I want to know what I can tell my child when I go home tonight why, as a Harvard student, I may not have a job when I finish here. You understand what I'm saying? So I'm very basic, and it's economic to me to have a job and to tell my children something about them getting a job. Now, can you get that to us?
Yeah. My reaction is that I think you have to tell your kids the realities. I mean, the chance is that you won't have a job, and that black people do have a harder time in this world, but that they have to realize what their opportunities are and do the best they can with it.
I hear what you're saying, sir, but I think what I'm trying to get from you all are, quote, what we started with at the beginning of this program, some strategies. See, I haven't heard any strategies. I've heard theories. And I'd like to hear some strategies for the 80s that black folks can apply. Economic, financial. Mr. Baeza did mention voting. That's one, I'm sure. But I'd like to hear some more of that, you say.
I think go on.
I think one strategy, certainly with your 16 and your 14-year-old, I think one thing is clear, that the emphasis, as always, still has to be on education, getting the most of it that they can. The emphasis still has to be, I think, on aspiring for excellence, because I think that can sort of open up some doors. I think, and to the extent that you can get yourself into that league and get your children into that league, whatever that means, I think they're going to be better. Practically, they're going to be better off. Their lifetime chances and outcomes are improved by how much they put in that context, particularly in school. I think in terms of what Ron said, and I think we are now at the stage where we are beginning to figure out what we as professionals can begin to do, perhaps in small groups or through larger groups, to make some sort of difference on a very real level to some people. And that's a question of seeing what needs are on a very local level or on very basic levels and trying to do something about that, trying to come together to do that. And I guess I would encourage, for example, I would encourage everybody in this room, to the extent that they can, to put $15, $20, $30 together and get a scholarship fund off to the ground. I mean, there are a million things like that need small steps that need to be taken right now that we are eminently capable of taking. That would be the first steps, I think, in making the situation a little better for your children.
I think one other thing, I don't come here in the spirit of being somebody to sit up here and pontificate. I look more as this being an interchange, because I don't have all the answers, and we together will have to find the answers. I think one thing to add to what Mario just said, in terms of what to tell your children, I think you have to tell them to learn how to compete with white people. Okay, I teach at Brandeis, which is a primarily Jewish environment. Black students come there and they're intimidated. He said, I never was around this many white people before. I don't know if I can compete with them. The students who come in who don't have that hang-up who are any smarter than the other kids, but who went to a white high school and know they can beat white people, get over. The others sit back, insecure, refusing to come see the professor when they have problems, and end up with the lowest grades in the class because they're intimidated. And I think that's a big barrier we need to get over in a lot of places. Okay, just the self-assuredness that there's a crisis of confidence that we have right now, and I think we need to work hard on that.
Yeah.
Baeza, in your comments on the new federalism, you suggested, at least I gathered that you were suggesting a strategy of adjustment, that we shift our focus from Washington to the state and local levels and develop strategies accordingly. Dr. Hefner suggested a philosophy that envisions at least a stabilized federal role or an expanding federal role. Is it possible for the black communities throughout this country to reconcile your differences of opinion or differences of direction or adjustment within a political framework that makes sense for the average black citizen?
I think the answer is yes, because I think the key to any movement is that it has to be multi-leveled. And I think to move actively on the local level is not to exclude moving or trying to move on the national level or the federal level. I certainly don't see those as mutually exclusive alternatives. I just think that right now there is a pause. There's nothing really happening at the local level. That's immediate, it's urgent, and there's going to be a lot of things happening in that level in the 80s. That needs to be dealt with. That's at crisis proportion right now. I think there is a shift in the federal government in terms of morality, just lots of things, in terms of their whole view of the constitutional system of government and the responsibilities there. But I still think that the federal government does have responsibilities and will continue to have responsibilities vis-a-vis black people. And that to that extent they need to be, I mean, we still need lobbying groups there, we still need to monitor what they're doing. And to the extent that we are all participants in this economy, obviously what happens nationally as well as what happens locally we have to deal with and be prepared to deal with. So I don't see them really as inconsistent. I mean, the way I look at it, I mean, we've got to begin to start talking about moving on just lots and lots of different levels. The federal government, the state government, the individual level, the very, very personal level, the interpersonal level. I mean, it's almost endless, and you can sort of pick your spot, pick your niche, and wherever that is, go for it. But do something, and I think the opportunities are abundant.
But you would agree that the new federalism as it is designed, and more than likely it will not be implemented in its present form, but let's say if it was, inherent in that design would be a capping of revenues available for services. It would actually have the effect of not only limiting the role, but reducing the size dramatically of the public sector. The question to Dr. Hefner then